Welcome to the J3U University podcast. I'm your host, John Jewett.
And I'm your co-host, Luke Miller.
Our mission is to elevate the physique coaching standard
and deliver the highest level of competitors to the stage.
Let's jump into today's episode. Road to the Olympia. How cliche of me to intro with that. But whatever, it is the road to Olympia, coming off this Vancouver win, which is awesome. And that's what I thought Luke and I should talk about today, because it's very relevant and pertinent. And there's probably going to be some good education takeaways from it too, especially since we're still very much deep in the competition season. And we also will have eventually in September our new contest prep module coming out in J3U, which I'm going to share some of this information that through the peaking process within that module as well. So, but anyway, yeah, winning Vancouver, what an awesome experience. And Luke was there with me.
It was amazing. It was really cool to see you on stage doing your thing, and by far the best package I think you brought ever, like a balance of conditioning and fullness, much sharper than Toronto. But from a muscularity standpoint, you didn't give up any in a muscularity comparison. So I think one of the things that was really cool to see is some of the posing adjustments we went through, kind of the assessment piece in the 48 hours out, I think really helped you stand next to a lot of those guys throughout the open, which I'm sure we'll talk about a little bit. We talked quite a bit about your posing throughout the 2 days leading in, which if you haven't seen the YouTube videos on it, go check that out, because we have some of that dialogue in there, right? I think that was huge. And then just some of the decisions kind of that last 12-ish hours were huge. I think waist control was, up there with the best it's ever been. And you held your look for so long because they ran y'all through the ringer at prejudge.
Yeah, I don't think I've ever posed for that long on stage. And before, in check-ins, meeting with Ron Hatch, he was the head judge out there. And he told you straight up, he's like, listen, there's not a lot of you guys, so you're going to have your stage time, and I'm going to work you out there. Which I just poker face was on, but back in my head, I'm like, oh, geez. All right. You don't want to be the guy that's fading out there and losing your waist control, not able to hold your poses anymore. And that's always been an ongoing fear on stage of being in that situation. Because it's just kind of a loss of control, especially in bodybuilding when we try to control everything really well. And lo and behold, it was, we got worked, it was very different. Yeah. I mean, I guess there's lots of stuff we can talk about, but whatever, well, let's talk about the posing first, because we're here. Is we normally in pros, you walk out by last name, and that's your first comparison round. So we did that. We line up on the diagonals, and then he's like, we're going to go through the comparison rounds again by alphabetical order, which I've never seen done. So that was really different. So it was an extra round on top of posing. So that's already 2 rounds. And then they do call outs for the first call out and bring those guys back. Then it's the second call out. So this is now, 3 rounds of posing. Then they have another confirmation round that they did. Then they brought out maybe a 5th and 6th place.
Yeah, they brought Stu and the guy that was the other guy that was on the outside. So it's 5th and 6th. Yeah. And then they brought the 4 of y'all back out. Yeah.
Then another round. So are we at 5 rounds of posing, I believe? And not
you skip the individual. You skip the individual too.
Yeah,
so
our individual.
6.
That's right. If you count that, 6 times of posing, and not just your quick posing rounds, lengthy posing rounds, and holding your poses for a long time too. So by the end of this thing, most of us are covered in sweat, belly breathing, you're falling apart out there. You're getting worked, and you're in line, so you don't know if the guy next to you is holding it all together or you're not. So you just have to go at it, either way. Then you look back at picture oh, thank God I wasn't the one that was, getting really losing it out there. But I think it goes to show that you just need to prepare for that situation no matter what. And when you get on stage, there's like this nervous excitement energy that can take place that can make people pose harder than what they practiced. And so I think it's very important for what you've practiced in your posing is what you end up executing on stage, and realize like in your practicing, pose as hard as you need to, just like you would on stage. That way you don't need to pose harder on stage. And a lot of people can take themselves out of the best pose by doing so, but it also just makes you work yourself over faster. And when you need to hold that through rounds and rounds, you're not going to be able to do it. So practice your posing like you would on stage. And then when you get on stage, do it just like you did during your practice, and have that time to be able to build up that posing endurance to be able to go those rounds. Like for me personally, what I do is being able to pose nonstop for 10 minutes. And that's going through quarter turns, through mandatories, holding those poses. And I usually have like 3 songs that play on my, on my little speaker while I go through it. And that's all I was capable of doing. And that executed perfectly for out there in Vancouver.
Yeah, and I bring that up kind of first before we get into any details, because I think the posing conditioning can almost ruin a physique on stage and almost ruin a peak if it's not there, right? Like if you walk out, you feel good, you look good, and then if you haven't spent that time going through your rounds of posing, like you could really start to fade quick and really struggle to present like the package that you actually brought. So I think that was an underlying, I don't want to say takeaway, but win of the whole week was the work you had put in preceding the actual peaking process just really paid dividends for this show specifically. So I think that was a huge part. And I think that kind of brings us to potentially like some of the decisions that were made kind of throughout those 2 days leading in. Because being there was a lot of fun, because it was cool to see you kind of like work through your process and, get to go back and forth a bit. But it was funny because we chatted a little bit about kind of your thoughts on, that session 2 days out. How valuable is that post-workout, visual, like kind of talking about potentially the assessment piece and how we're going about the assessment piece now, and how, valuable is this information and what information was used to make some of those final decisions.
Yeah. And so with a lot of this peak week is planning and trying to create your best show day execution with what might be happening on that day. So there's, with consideration for when you're going to do a practice pump up or your training sessions and trying to see how that might resemble what you're going to look like on stage. But also you need to consider like, we're thinking about what's the backstage going to be like how long are we going to be back there? What's the temperatures going to be like? Things that some people don't plan for that can make you go through food faster or slower, or even make you sweat more or less. Because I start to ask, competitors from the previous year, like, hey, what was Vancouver like? What's the backstage like? And a lot of people were saying like, hey, it's like in a gymnasium. There's some fans, but it's really hot. And people were like, either like bring your own fan, and so you can stay cool. So this is like a insider info of like what you might want to do for your show planning. Then also like how early I maybe want to get to the show and not have to sit back there for so long, get hot. And then also just knowing like, hey, Ron likes to run his guys to the ringer out there, that you're going to need adequate amount of food and hydration to hold yourself throughout that posing duration, opposed to maybe someone else where they go through their normal rounds pretty quick, or it's a really big show to where you're going to have downtime between these rounds. That's a lot different for what you might want to do hydration wise going in. So when we're looking at the days prior, how much food and fluid I'd have before we went train, usually we'd go like 2 meals in, and that would be roughly like, 90 ounces of fluid or so, 100 ounces of fluid. And I could train and, I'd be full blown by the end of this training session, which, okay, that easily sustains me. But like what Luke's bringing up is that how reflective is an hour of training session versus when someone's going through maybe 10 minutes of posing on stage. It's not quite the same, with the exception of Vancouver, as this was like an hour of posing on stage. But in most cases, your post-training look isn't going to be reflective of what that stage look pump up is going to be. So you shouldn't you need to adjust your food and fluid based around that. And that's what Luke and I were kind of doing out there of making these adjustments, and not only looking at the post workout look, but also like, what is the look after, right before we'd have meals. So like my best look was not fasted, because that was a little flat, sharp, great waist control, but my upper body shots just didn't have quite the pop. But getting one meal in, and then this would be like 70 ounces of fluid, I believe. Right before meal 2, I did some practice pump up. You're like, man, this is kind of a good balance. The thing that fades me the quickest, what we were saying, is like my abdominal area starts to wash out, and where I would say, spill. And also the food volume is an issue. You're not able to cinch down that waist as tight. So these are all things consideration. We're starting to map out, what do we want to do on show day? And kind of what we eventually came up with was, hey, one meal in, which was 80 grams of carbs and 10 grams of fat, a little bit of protein, I think it was like 30 grams of protein, is a good amount of food for the fullness that I need. But that fluid amount is probably more than what I need. And reducing that by 50% will maintain the condition. It'll be also less volume in my stomach. And we end up bringing the food volume, making it very condensed. So it's just going down from like Rice Krispie treats, like dried fruits, just whey, to where I wouldn't have so much in my stomach. And that gives a good balance of fullness, waist control, and still staying very conditioned, which I basically only come up like 1 pound from my fasted look. And that's what we ended up putting on stage, and kind of what we were trying to emulate every day going into the peak. And one thing that was very different from Toronto was, in Toronto, I loaded carbs really hard. I did a pretty big backload, which partly was like I was kind of dieting down into the show. And I feel like it's tough. I feel like I just sped up the more I ate. I was like, I don't want to do that again. So I'm just going to eat as I need. And this show is really like, I'm already full. I get one meal in and I'm there. So why do I need to load? I don't. I just need to keep up with my body weight and eat off that. So basically, like, early in the week, started around 500 grams of carbs, 50 grams of fat. And then the highest I got to was 630 grams of carbs and like 90 grams of fat. So I definitely pushed fats higher, and that helped keep food volume a lot lower. And I feel like I wasn't having to chase down my body weight as much like I did in Toronto, just keeping fats lower and pushing carbohydrate really high.
Yeah, I think it was a killer decision. I think one that kind of guided that was, we went back and forth a bit. That fasted look was actually still a really killer look. Like, obviously 1 meal in, a bit of fluids was absolutely better, but it was something that we didn't hate it. Like, it wasn't so flat that it just completely ruined the visuals. So it shouldn't take much to bring you up from that to where the best visual is. Plus, it means you can probably hold that pretty well if you're waking up fasted in a almost there kind of a visual, right? Which is, just like some thoughts for people that do struggle to kind of bring it in on show day. It's like, if you can set up your peaking where you're waking up as close to that show weight as possible, if you're competing early in the day, which was another thing I think benefited us, was like, you knew your stage time is like, you were 10 o'clock on the dot. We knew exactly how to space those meals out, and you knew exactly the rate of fluid intake that would get you exactly where you wanted, because you were 10 o'clock sharp. Which is huge. And because the unpredictability of shows is, you don't know if you're 2 or 3 classes in, how long these classes are going to take, right? So I think that is something that if you do struggle with like chasing someone, it really can help to do the work on the front end, which is where being ready early to have that fatigue drop and get to a steadier baseline before you're having to like backload and chase, right? I think that was kind of a huge part of this peaking process. Now, I do think, because we talk about carrying a scale weight with us all the time, right? We talk about bringing body weights and some of the adjustments in those body weight visuals that happened like leading into the show, right? Because, you sent me some visuals earlier in the week. You ended up standing on stage about 1.5 pounds to almost 2 pounds lighter than kind of where those visuals were that you liked the best earlier in the week. And like some of those things that did contribute to that ideal visual being about, 1.5 pounds to 2 pounds lighter.
Yeah, I know we teach around in J3U about visuals and pairing this to a scale weight to try to find your best look. And that scale weight is going to give you pretty close idea of what might be ideal, but there's a lot of things that can influence a scale weight too. And so earlier in a peak week, the variables you're changing within nutrition can also start shifting your scale weight down a little more. In a lot of cases, what we see and what can be confusing for people is like, as they're increasing food throughout peak week, you might see scale weight actually moving down. And what we teach is like, a scale weight moves down, usually that means someone's getting flatter. However, you need to understand the other variables that could be changing scale weight too. And so there is going to be a degree of fatigue there. Even though I wasn't very fatigued going into this show, still with steps high and the amount of posing I was doing, legs are not that as fresh as they could be. So as I reduce steps and reduce posing and increase food, there's definitely like just a reduced inflammation on my legs that's happening. So that's scale weight drop there. That's a potential. Also, as we go into peak week, yes, carbohydrates are increasing, but fiber reduction is taking place. And also there's a condensing of meals that takes place too. So you have a food volume reduction and also less GI weight. So there's another scale weight reduction where you could very well be at a lighter body weight and have a better visual. Then the counter one to this is that you're loading carbohydrate. So you could fill out some glycogen and that would bring weight up. So you might actually see a net, just a balance of like some drop and some increase to where you have the same body weight, but the visual's better. Like that could happen. But in my case, I end up drifting down a pound across like the last few days to where I was kind of like end up being like 2 pounds lighter than what a potential stage weight would have been. But the visuals were significantly better. So at that case, don't chase the scale. It's all about the visuals, of course, but you need to be able to also understand the other variables that could contribute to that scale weight change. And that's what we saw. Like I was waking up one day out fasted lighter, but I looked fuller. Like I could almost like do some push-ups and get a pump, right? Compared to the previous day, I wasn't able to get that, even though I was a little bit heavier. So yes, like the scale weight's very beneficial, but it's a tool, and you need to understand how that tool can be influenced by the things that you are changing around peak week. I think it's helpful to, when you control and standardize as many variables as you can, so you can pull that out. And I think the problem where people make mistakes is that there's too much changing at once to where it's hard to really see what is influencing like your scale weight or your best visual. So like without here, we really had it down to everything was the same every day. It was just moving some carbs and fats up and changing some food sources. So it was easy to tell what was happening when you looked across visuals and scale weight. Thanks everyone for tuning in to today's podcast. Are you struggling to hit your peak on show day? Feeling lost in the off season? Upgrade your coaching game with J3U University. Our program covers everything from off season to contest prep to peak week, all based from real client results. Along with our comprehensive physique curriculum, you'll also get access to our 4 rooms with our J3U team to answer any questions you have, and live Q&A sessions to further your coaching and athlete experience. We are the source of education for top IFBB pros and coaches. Join us to elevate the coaching standard at J3 University. Let's get back to today's podcast.
Yeah, and you just made it so predictable. It's funny, and I do want to bring this up because we had a conversation while we were there. Like, you did that pump up on Saturday, one day out, and it was like you did like 2 rounds maybe, and you were like, yeah, that's it, right? Yeah. It's like when it comes that quick, it's like, you know that's a place that's, one, very easily repeatable because of how standardized the variables were, but 2, it's a fullness factor that's extremely present from a feel perspective, which I think is an important question to ask. Like my athletes who coach with me know, like one of the questions that I send to them almost every time they check in was, how did posing feel? Like, was it easy to contract? Did you pump up easy? If there was a pump up associated with that check-in. And so it's an important thing because I use the scale as a reference point, right? Like it's a tool for me to use as a reference, but it's not the end all be all that I'll land a peak. And I think that was a really, not a takeaway because we do this all the time, but it's a point that I do want to pull out because it's a part of the repeatability and predictability that made it very apparent that it could just be put on stage like that with a slight fluid adjustment.
The interesting thing that I found is like, and I don't know if it's being in the open and being bigger, but also not having to suck down at all, is that the weight range I have to work within is a lot more narrow. Oh, it's not. No, yeah, it's
Yeah, it's narrow.
Yeah,
212
yeah. Because there was such a greater degree of flatness that was there that it took a lot more to fill out. And in turn, like, and also the condition doesn't fade because when you're already pretty full, you just don't have a lot left to fill in of that hole and to before you spill over, which in a way, 212 is more forgiving because of that. And it's a lot less forgiving in the open. Now, if you were the open guy that was probably has a hard time losing body fat and chase down getting flat to get the last bit of fat off, you might be in that situation where there is more of a range. But I think in a lot of cases, the range is smaller. And I think also too, you have to consider the PED aspect around the open. Like a lot of the classic physique guys or 212 guys, they're removing a lot of the water retaining compounds just to simply make weight, while a lot of those compounds have influences on aldosterone to where you're more sensitive to changes in fluid and sodium. So a little bit goes a long way. And maybe that's part of it too. Like I usually would never have growth hormone in place when I was doing these 212 shows. And now I do have a lot of it in place, and where I see like pretty quickly throughout the day, a softer look will come through. Now, could it be the other part? Like I'm already pretty damn full. That could be it. Could it be like the PD aspect's different? That could be weighing in a little bit, maybe a little bit of both. So just something that I've picked up on is the range is a lot tighter to work within.
Yeah, and I think that goes for most weight class athletes, right? I mean, it's funny, like the last 212 show you did, like we were talking, make weight 212, right? But is your best look at 217? Like, are you really pulling up like 5 pounds? Like that was kind of the conversations that we were having when you were doing 212.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it's like, now you're within this like 2.5 pound gap. That's just, that's it.
And man, it's interesting because now I think about, you already think about your next peak for the Olympia, right, which is a Friday night show and a Saturday night show. Like I haven't done something like that for one ever. So I've done, I'll take that back. I've done something similar. I've done a Friday morning and a Saturday night, but that time gap is nice because you can like bring fluids back in for your morning show and you don't have this rebound kick. But for that is unique. Like you almost need to hold it for all day Friday, and you're likely going to have some issues come Saturday if you bring too much fluid back in. So you almost need to keep pretty restricted the whole time. So that should be an interesting one.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to kind of go through the process of trialing some like what fluid keeps it the longest. I think that's going to be kind of the coolest thing, right? Because you let your body weight drift back up a bit, but then bring it back down and be at a place where that testing can happen.
I think that is the situation where, if people say you never do this, that's usually not the case in coaching, where there might be a case where you probably want some type of diuretic on hand, just as a contingency plan if you do get some fight back with counter regulatory hormones and starting to actually retain some water, and having to go even lower in water might be your ability to keep water and sodium up and keep diuresis happening. So again, we're getting a little ahead of ourselves, but it already has you thinking about next peaks. With Vancouver and posing that long on stage, we weigh ourselves when we get off stage, and it was like a 1.5 pound body weight drop coming off stage, which it actually looked pretty solid, getting a little tighter. But, you know, I think that goes to show, like, if someone was already pulled down, like a little bit too dehydrated, that's the person that when they drop that 1.5 pounds, that they look really flat, and they might, and that's what we're saying. When you fade on stage, you start to lose that pop and fullness because you're just burning through glycogen and getting a little bit more dehydrated than what you want. And then a lot of times you see guys like, you know, you might hear someone say that, oh, they came to life the more rounds that they did, where you have someone that's at an adequate hydration status, starts burning through a little bit, and they just get sharper, and it makes everything pop even a little bit more. And what I noticed too is, like, even when I start posing, is like my mouth won't be that dry, but I start posing and my mouth will immediately start getting dry. It's like there's some fluid shifts happening there, and now I'm starting to get more into this dehydrated state, which you don't want to feel like that right off the bat in your posing. And when you wake up first in the morning, mouth just like feels drier and sand. Usually you're pretty flat, and it's not going to get better by not drinking water. So that's one thing that it has a confirming thing in my mind with, like, these subjectives of, like, okay, I can feel the muscle contract. Like, I could flex it to where it almost feels like I can make it cramp, like I'm full enough. But then also, like, as I'm posing, I'm feeling this kind of like a drying of the mouth happening. So, and then you look down, you'll see like sharper lines coming through. It's like, okay, this is a good spot to be in, so you can withstand the rounds of posing, and your look is only going to improve as you keep posing more.
Mm-hmm. Amen. I think that wraps it as far as, like, things for people to kind of pull from that weekend. Is there anything else you would say to pull from?
That was a lot of things I wanted to touch on. Just trying to, research your show ahead and make sure you have the most convenient setup for yourself. Makes it low stress, but also anything that could go wrong, you might have thought of it in advance. I think just, being insightful with trying to emulate every day like show day, and finding the look and keeping the simpler you can keep a peak, the better, and only make it more complicated as it needs to. And I think those are some like of the main takeaways from this past weekend, and just carrying that data into the Olympia prep and peak, and really excited for what they'll be. I might have to do an episode just on what that looks like, because it's a really weird timeline going into Olympia. You have 12 weeks, which is not very short. It's also not terribly long. So what do you do with that? So maybe we'll hit that on another episode.
Yeah, absolutely. If you guys need anything, comment below.
And we will talk to you next time.
Questions.